to welcome you here, not just because we have an amazing panel, but because we are talking about probably the most important topic that we can, which is how competitive the UK is, how we can get competitiveness up, growth up, what role regulation is going to play in that. And as I said, we had an astonishingly good panel, obviously. Rees-Mogg MP is the Minister for Brexit Opportunities, who will be telling us all about the opportunities that we can seize. We have Tracy Blackwell, who is the CEO of the Pension Insurance Corporation, who are kindly supporting this event. Giles is the Economics Editor at the FT, and one of the great sages of the profession. And obviously Ben Houchen is the elected Mayor of the Tees Valley, and we're very grateful to you for coming down to the evil metropolis to give us the benefits of your thoughts. So each of our panelists will give their thoughts, then we'll have a conversation, and then partly because of the sound issues, we'll have a Q&A based on those that people submitted in advance. So I guess with that, I'll go to the Minister to kick us off. UK competitiveness, opportunities and challenges post-Brexit.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and thank you for staying through the fire alarm. It might be quite tempting to have a few fire alarms, so he was actually in various buildings up and down Whitehall, but not yet. But thank you for having me. Robert, thank you for inviting me, and for hosting today's event, and for the Pension Insurance Corporation for sponsoring it. I've been a great fan of the CPS for many years. I actually did some work for them a long time ago in my year off, so I've had a long-standing association with this excellent think tank that's always been at the forefront since its foundation of conservative thinking. And to talk about the vision for the UK economy that's more efficient, more innovative, and more productive. Using our newfound freedoms, we will be able to propel growth, drive innovation, and level up across the United Kingdom. And this is going to be things like artificial intelligence and gene editing, to the future of transport and data protection. We will recreate a new pro-growth, high-standards regulatory framework that gives UK businesses the confidence to innovate, invest, and create jobs, bringing benefits to the whole country. Competition and innovation and deregulation sit at the heart of my mission, and indeed, fortunately, of my brief. I'm very lucky to have been given a brief that fits in with things I've been talking about since very long before I became a minister. The talent and ambition across the United Kingdom is our greatest national asset, and I believe that the government should never stand in the way of it flourishing. And I've been hearing what regulations the British public want abolished. They've been getting in touch with me in their hundreds after I asked them to through articles in The Sun and the Sunday Express, things that make life harder for small businesses, shut out competition, or simply increase the cost of operating. And I think a lot of this is going to be through small changes, but small changes by the dozen, by the score, and by the gross, so that we can boost our economy and improve the lives of the British people. So in January, before I was appointed, the Benefits of Brexit paper was published, and this set out the government's plan to transform the UK into the best regulated economy in the world. So what does that mean? I mean, as a general rule, if a government document says something the opposite of which is nonsense, we weren't going to publish a document saying we were going to be the worst regulated economy in the world. You have to think about what it actually means. The headline's fine, but what comes next? So this is having a renewed regulatory framework based on UK principles and reviewing retained EU law. So the Prime Minister, in addition, announced a major cross-government effort to reform, repeal and replace outdated EU law that will aim to cut £1 billion of red tape. And that's a minimum. That's not the maximum of our ambition. Ease regulatory burdens and contribute to the government's mission to unite and level up. I already have, and I hope to publish in due course, a list of about 1,500 pieces of retained EU law, and then people can see them in all their technicolor glory and see which ones can be got rid of, because it's that base of knowledge that is so important to understanding where we need to go next. And we must from now on regulate in the best interests of the British people and of the UK economy. So what does that mean? That means using our sovereign approach to follow a common law process protected by independent regulators and designed to strengthen the UK market. It means that the best regulations can be very effective, and we must learn from that and improve on that. And that was shown by the MHRA as the vaccine was being developed. Supporting innovation and delivering competitive advantage should be the norm for regulators, not the unusual. The UK has some perfectly respectable regulation, but we need to make it less and we need to make it more effective. And we need to be proportional. When markets achieve the best outcomes, we should allow the markets to do it. So actually, IPSO is a better regulator than IMPRESS. IPSO doesn't threaten the freedom of the press. IMPRESS was set up with exactly that in mind. That is a market solution run by the market rather than a government one. And we need to see what works. We need to be based on results. An awful lot of government is process-based. Almost all of the EU is process-based. However brilliant the process, if it doesn't actually make the economy more efficient, what on earth's the point? So we need to be concerned about results. And we want to make sure that we help other people across the world deregulate too. If we can show it works, others will follow. And we want regulation that essentially has a new culture, so that it places the interest of UK businesses and consumers front and centre, that will help us achieve the objectives of the government, but these are the objectives of the British people. We want to keep up with innovation and invention so that our high growth sectors can boost the vitality of the UK research, and we want predictable and proportionate regulation. People need to know where they stand, giving companies the certainty that they need to grow. And we can ensure that our regulations have both high standards, but also benefit business and consumers. So, what do we need? We need to encourage investment, we need higher productivity, and we need prosperity. And we need this particularly in the context of a cost of living crisis. The new figures out from the ONS just this morning. The cost of living crisis is fundamental. And how we deal with that is going to require supply-side reforms, and supply-side reforms come from making the economy more efficient, which comes from dealing with this whole issue of regulation. And we want to change bad regulations, with the onus of proof on regulations being on the regulator, not the regulated, so that we get the balance right. And we've got some of this coming through from our Brexit opportunities that are already delivered. Restoring democratic control, you may think, is a highfalutin theoretical approach. No, it's not. It's fundamental, because, ladies and gentlemen, you can go to your MP and you can say, this regulation is ruining, strangling my business, what are you going to do about it? And until a few years ago, your MP would turn around and say to you, nothing, because it's all decided elsewhere. So I'm so sorry, we're ruining your business, it's just tough. Now, no MP can say that. No government minister can say that. It is up to us. Our feet are being held to the fire, and let us stoke up that fire so that its temperature is very hot. Because that's the way. Restoring democratic control is not an esoteric, nice-to-do, constitutional peculiarity of people like me. It is fundamental to how we ensure that we have the supply-side reforms that we need. But this involves restoring the UK legal system properly, so that we have laws made by Parliament interpreted by the courts, not the courts telling Parliament what their laws ought to be. That's how democratic accountability comes in. And we've shown this already. I've already mentioned the MHRA and the vaccine rollout. That was fundamental. That was so important to getting things done quickly. A regulator that was on the side of industry. I mean, if you were standing up, you'd all fall down. It's lucky you're not falling off your seats to have a regulator on the side of industry, rather than being there to be a nuisance. And we've been able to move into striking free trade deals. The rollover of our old ones, the new ones with Australia and New Zealand, the proposal with India, and of course the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So these are opening up markets, and it all ties in with the whole approach that we are taking. And we've got all the good ideas from the Tigger report. Ian Duncan Smith, Teresa Villas, and George Freeman brought that together. And that's looking at data. How do we regulate data properly? I'm tempted to do a show of hands. Who thinks GDPR is a good law? No hands go up. I mean, I didn't give you much chance to put your hands up, to be perfectly fair. But GDPR is not something that is going to make our economy fit for the next century. And I'm glad to say that that will be reformed. AI. How can we do more with AI? But AI is heavily dependent on data. Life sciences. I'm working very closely with George Freeman, who has that in his brief to make sure that we have the most innovative life sciences background. Agriculture. Well, gene editing bill is going to come forward. We are going to be able to do sensible things that make farming more productive, more pro-growth. And we need, and this is going to be my bit, to help small companies by reducing the burdens on them. So I shall be introducing the procurement bill in the next session of Parliament, which will make it easier for small, medium-sized enterprises to apply for government contracts. and the regulation, the bureaucracy around it. The briefing I have so far is that now if you want to bid for a contract, you have to enter your name and address 70 times, 70 times. That will go down to 1. And in and of itself, that's tiny. But if you think of saving 69 entries of your name and address over the number of contracts that you may wish to apply for, across the economy as a whole, it suddenly becomes important and delivers for the public purse and for the economy overall. So we've just started on this. You know, the progress is being made, but we have just started to make our economy more efficient, innovative and productive. And this is all about achieving the objectives set out, the Build Back Better and the Levelling Up. Forgive the slogans, but they do underpin what we're trying to do. And we've now got the freedom to do it and to make policy choices that achieve this for the country as a whole. And this, I think, is very exciting because, dare I say, people like me in the CPS have been saying for a very long time that if we can get this right, we can have a stronger and faster growing economy. But it hasn't been under our control. And now it is. If we don't do it, you can come and blame Robert, because the CPS has been saying this for so long. And I've always been deeply influenced by the CPS, so of course it wouldn't be my fault, it'd be Robert's. So it was a satisfactory bargain. And we need to be bold. We don't want to be mealy-mouthed. It's why I want the ideas coming in from industry and from individuals, because we actually need a change in the culture of regulation. We do not want the European busybody approach. We don't want the approach that backs incumbents and monopolists. We want one that puts the interests of consumers first. Regulators, when they go to bed every night, should say to themselves how every day and in every way they make the lives of the British people better and better. They should not be saying, how do we make sure that our peak cap is sufficiently peaked so that we can go out and annoy people when they're trying to go about their daily lives. The man in Whitehall does not know best. You will remember a socialist cabinet minister said that, I think, in 1947, but we should never forget that's the basic view of the socialist. We don't think that. We think the people know best, and that they know best what is good for them with businesses, and the government must be a facilitator of that so that we achieve the prosperity that we need. So thank you, Robert, for inviting me today, for hosting this conversation, and I'm much looking forward to hearing from everybody else, because I don't think I have the monopoly of knowledge. Indeed, I think the knowledge is elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And there are some seats towards the front if any of those standing at the back want to take advantage. Tracy, the Minister mentioned private investment, which I guess is your cue.
Absolutely, thanks. And thank you, Minister. So everyone else today is going to talk about what we can get out of reform, whether it be investments in AI and fintech, all the good things, infrastructure that can happen. But I'm going to talk about the supply side. Where does the money come from? Where does it get paid from? This country has an asset that is envied all over the world, and nobody really understands it. The huge amount of long-term savings that is sitting in pension funds, insurance companies, and private savings. It's £5 trillion. It is trillions and trillions of pounds. It's an amazing asset that generally gets forgotten. When I tell people that I do pensions and I do insurance, generally their eyes glaze over, which is absolutely understandable until you talk about the £5 trillion that can be put to work to invest in the country. But successive governments have courted Canadians or Australians. In fact, there was an announcement recently about Australians investing in the UK to fund our infrastructure. Brexit actually gives us the opportunity to mobilise the UK's long-term savings. That backs pensions, backs savings, that goes out decades into the future, and it funds our long-term infrastructure needs, whether it be social housing, renewable energy, nuclear, urban regeneration, all of that sort of stuff. It's incredibly important. And the money's sitting there. We just need to mobilise it. And that does go to what the Minister was talking about with regards to regulation. The life chances of millions of people, the future of the country, really is dependent on a very quietly raging technocratic debate that is going on in Whitehall and in the regulators, Threadneedle Street in the city, about how to reform financial services regulation. Again, a really dry topic, but incredibly important for how we can use and mobilise the savings of the country into the future. Just as an example, so this is all happening. We do invest. I run a company that invests £50 billion. all of it long term, a huge amount of it into the UK and into UK infrastructure, renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. And it is happening, but more can happen. And if we reform financial services regulation right, and in, I love to hear, a proportionate way, we can unlock even more to be invested into the future of the economy. It's really important, but it is this debate that's raging underneath the surface. And an example of some of the obstacles that we're going to see in terms of when we have to actually start to tackle some of this regulation, tackle some of those regulators. It isn't quite as straightforward as telling them what to do. They seem to have their own views on what should happen. Just an example of the type of investment. My company, we've almost completed a redevelopment of a car park in Manchester city centre, following a £130 million investment we made in 2020. Once it's complete, we'll have developed 520 residential apartments, 6,000 square feet of commercial space, and it's a huge part of the regeneration of Manchester's central business district. Built to very high specification because we're going to own it forever. We plan to use that to back our long-term pension promises. But just to give a sense of how important this stuff is, so this development is putting £2 million a week into the Manchester economy. It's creating 550 jobs during the construction phase, and by the end of it, we will have completed more than 7,000 apprentice weeks to give people life-changing opportunities and training. So it's really important. And I want to see these sorts of developments in every region of the UK. And it's possible. It really is possible. There is plenty of funds out there to fund this. We need to mobilize it. We need to get rid of the regulations or reform the regulations that stop some of this investment happening. And if the government gets the reform right, it will unlock billions. We're estimating for ourselves that we'll go from 30 billion to 50 billion over the next 10 years. And as an industry as a whole, the numbers are somewhere around 85 to 90 billion. That's a huge amount of money that can go to fund local infrastructure, local projects. But to seize the opportunity, we need system-wide thinking, which is what the minister was talking about. Rather than an almost exclusive focus, I can only talk about financial services regulators, but I expect the rest of the regulators are very similar, where it's all about safety. It's all about no risk to the public, no risk to the system. Minimizing risk sounds like a really good thing, but it does come with a cost. The financial crisis certainly showed that sufficient levels of capitalization are incredibly important, and we need to make sure that's the case. But there's a balance in all of these things, and I think what we've lost over the last few years is definitely the balance. Excessive risk aversion in investments and trapping high levels of capital in financial services balance sheets leads to dead money, investment concentration in a very narrow range of assets, and not being able to fund a lot of those things that we all want to see funded. And the approach also, and this is where some of the problems come in, unintentionally creates a gold mine for lawyers, consultants, compliance officers. There is a cost to that gold mine. It is coming from additional costs being paid by pension scheme clients and by end users of these projects. They end up on the rents that social housing tenants pay, on renewable electricity bills, and so on. And that's without taking into account the lost chances that we've seen. But as the Governor of the Bank of England said in a recent speech, achieving stronger and more sustainable growth in the economy will enhance the regulator's primary objectives of safety and soundness and policyholder protection. There's nothing in there about competitiveness. There's nothing in there about customers. In the views of regulators' minds, it is all about safety. It is all about safety and soundness. That all comes with a cost. And that's why, if we're looking at regulations, it has to be systemic. It has to be on a system-wide approach. But as the minister said, this can only be done with a different regulatory view. And I'm not at all convinced that the regulators are thinking that way yet. So one of the most important legacies of Brexit, to me certainly, should be a change in the view of risk taken by financial regulators, probably all regulators, and to specifically include investment in the economy as a key focus for them alongside consumer protection. And that is definitely simply not happening. From a regulatory perspective, obviously there's a huge amount of tension here. We're going to see more of it as the government tries to reform some of this regulation. But in my view, the decision really is a political one. It's not a technocratic one. And ultimately, appropriate and timely financial services regulatory reform will only be a success if the government seizes the opportunity now. We have a golden opportunity now. We really do. I can't emphasize it enough. We can create a virtuous circle in this country where the investment is coming from here, from our savings, from our pension funds, from our insurance companies to invest in our economy. But we need to make a regulatory framework, a regulatory system that really supports that. That's the prize, and it's a big one. Thanks.
Ben.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you to the CPS. It's the first time I've been in London to be able to help the CPS with one of these events, having done a lot at conference. I am down here for other work as well, so in case anybody's watching at home, I am here to do a job. But I wanted to give everybody a specific example of how competitiveness can help the UK economy, and I do think that the government and the civil service can learn from a lot of what we are doing in Teesside. If we go back to 2015, which is really the catalyst of everything that we've done in the region, it started when Redcar Steelworks closed. It was the lowest ebb of a region where more than 3,500 people lost their jobs, which was down from many tens of thousands of high in the 60s and 70s. And we were in a place where we had an economy that didn't have a future, we had a lack of direction, and we had a community that felt like it had been left down. And through devolution and through my election, one of the key things and one of the key projects I've had to do is, one, solve a headache for the government who were putting many tens of millions of pounds into a site that was lost money. Just to give you an idea, the government was spending £20 million a year just keeping the steelworks as it was, including more than £1 million a month in nitrogen going through what is the coke oven gas main. Just literally pumping nitrogen gas was costing the UK government £1 million a month. And there was no economic output for any of that. So when we sat down and we looked at how do we solve, one, the headache, how do we reduce the burden on the taxpayer, but actually how do we turn this site and this region into an economy that has a bright future, the first thing came to me is the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why here? You know, we're looking at a regional economy. We don't just compete with the likes of Newcastle and Manchester and, dare I say it, even London. We're actually competing on a global scale. And so when we ask ourselves the question of, well, why would somebody come here? We're not asking why would they come to Teesside, we're asking why would they even come to the UK before they even get to the point of why they would want to come to Teesside. And so what we've done is we've tried to build a practical framework that's outputs driven to say to investors and saying to people that have globally mobile capital, this is why you should not just come to the UK, but you should come to Teesside. So a couple of things that we've been able to do. One, actually having a vision and a strategy that is very clear to the market is important. I think that can go a long way from a UK government policy point of view, being able to very clearly clarify and set out the vision that you have, the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, rather than just the process that you're implementing. That's really important, and we did that by creating a large master plan that covers 4,500 acres of land. That's 6 times the size of the City of London. I think it's just over 1.5 times the size of Gibraltar as a country. It is a vast brownfield site, the largest site in Western Europe. That ticks a box. It has scale that this globally mobile capital that Tracy was talking about is interested in. That's one box, but actually we could say, well, there's lots of sites across North America, Africa, the Far East that have probably sites of even larger scale. So why would we still come to the UK? Why would we come to Teesside? Well, on top of that, one of the big burdens we've seen, certainly since my election, but I know this is a problem that we've seen across the country for many years, is the regulatory framework, in particular planning. The permitting and planning that is an obstruction to large-scale energy production or manufacturers coming to the UK has lost this country many millions of pounds in tax take and huge GVA value that has gone elsewhere in the world. So how did we tackle that? Well, one of the benefits that this government gave me by being able to set up mayoral development corporations were planning powers over the site that we had that took it in effect away from the local authority. And now we can go to investors and say, well, not only do we have one of the largest brownfield sites in Western Europe, we've also dealt with the planning for you. So the Mayoral Development Corporation actually went and got 14.5 million square feet of outline planning for the investor. So when we speak to investors, one of the biggest problems we now have is to explain to an investor, it is true to say that you will be able to start on-site building your factory in 9 weeks. That's the biggest problem that we have because, in all honesty, because of the history of the UK regulatory framework, they just don't believe that we can do it in that timescale. And when you speak to the large-scale manufacturers, energy producers, people who are putting in billions of pounds worth of capital, they're building in at least 12, 18 months, if not more than 2 years, just into the planning process, which is not what capital needs. It needs to be able to get its money working, and it needs to be able to place it quickly and making sure that they can deploy it as quickly as possible. Now, often that invariably, historically, has led to that money going elsewhere. So again, we've got the site, we've got the land, we've dealt with the planning and regulatory issue, which I cannot overstate, certainly from a manufacturing point of view, just how much of a hurdle that is. And the other thing that we've been able to overlay much more recently, which is a really interesting one, because again, it's outcomes driven and it helps, in effect, deregulate a site slightly outside of the UK market, was the free port that we were able to get, Teesside as being the first and largest free port in the UK, which I do owe a thanks to the CPS and the Chancellor for as the bastions of this policy before I was elected in 2016. But again, when you go to those investors and you say, here's the land, here's the planning, you're not paying business rates, you're not paying employers' national insurance contributions, you're not paying stamp duty, land tax. Some of the other regulatory reforms are much simpler. There are some accountancy rules around buildings and structures allowance. That all of a sudden makes you much, much more competitive. So that's another benefit that we have, being able to say to investors, actually from a financial point of view, your return on investment is going to be greater here than it might be elsewhere. And then the final piece of the jigsaw, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the panel later on, so I won't labour too much, is energy costs. And when you're looking at manufacturing in particular, and especially energy-intensive industries, the cost of energy in the UK, separate from the cost of energy crisis that we're having, which I think will play itself out over the next 18 months, albeit there's a short-term spike that we need to deal with, we are not competitive when it comes to commercial energy costs. We are at least a third more expensive than mainland Europe, and those are often the countries that we're competing with when we're looking at globally mobile capital. Well, again, as a circumstance of history and a look of good fortune from the steelworks that we inherited, one of the regulatory frameworks that are in place in the UK at the moment, albeit I understand from the civil service anyway, they're not that keen on them, are private wire networks. And the steelworks has the largest private wire network in the UK. Why is that important? Well, if you're on a private wire network and you're a manufacturer and you're using energy that's generated on the same site, then you're what's classed as behind the meter. You're not paying the additional levies and the additional cost, which makes us uncompetitive with mainland Europe. So we're able as a site to say, there's the land, there's the planning, there are the discounts and the reduction in regulatory requirements for the free port, and by the way, we can be cost competitive on energy by providing you energy up to a third off what is the standard UK energy price for commercial investment. Then all of a sudden you've got something very special. But from my point of view, that's fantastic for Teesside, and we are winning huge amounts of investment in offshore wind, energy generation, gigafactories, automotive. The list goes on and on and on, and I'm sure you'll see more of that in the coming months as we start to move into construction. The question I think we need to answer is, how do we take what has been a great success story on a micro scale within the UK and scale that up across the UK? And one of the things that I was very keen to campaign for Brexit on was the fact that I think, and we've actually seen it play out since we left the European Union, is the paternalistic nature of being a member of the EU. We've been overly reliant on a policy, procedural, regulatory framework that was ordained from upon high that we just received. And that, I think, creates a level of complacency within the civil service, because that's not something they need to think about. It's not something they actively need to work towards. But what we've actually found ourselves in is in a position where the training wheels are off. You know, we've literally just decided to move out of the parents' house, and we've moved into our own place, and that means all of the decisions that we take, we get to decide. Now, that's a huge opportunity. We get to make any decision we want to do. We can put the TV on the wall, we can put the bed in the living room, you can do whatever you like. But also that comes with the responsibility of those decisions. And if we're not careful, the opportunity that sits before us could become a burden where we get caught in the headlights. And that indecision and that concern about making the wrong decision can lead to no decision at all. And I think that would be the biggest loss to the UK economy. And I do hope, from what we've heard from this morning from the Minister, does come true, because I think it will go a long way to actually taking off those shackles, making us much more competitive, and putting the UK into a long-term trajectory of growth, jobs, and our rightful place in the world as a leading player in the G7. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you to the CPS for this really rather lovely event. I'm going to talk a bit about what we know about the UK economy as a whole, very much sticking to the whole of the UK rather than any one sector or region, And then crucially, I'm sorry, I'm going to use a technical economics term. I'm going to really distinguish between things that are really big and things that are really small. And that is, I think, the most important thing when we're talking about the competitiveness of the UK that we need to focus on. Let's just put Britain into perspective, first of all. Measured correctly, Britain is a large economy in the world. It's the 8th largest in the world. I think we should say today, just after the French elections, that is just ahead of France. But measured as GDP per head, we're the 28th largest. We're not particularly special. And again, comparing us with France, we're a little bit below France. So we're big, but not special. We do need to recognise our place in the world. And then we also need to know what's happened over the last 12 years or so since the global financial crisis. And I'm not saying this in any way on a political level. This has happened to many countries, but Britain has been hit harder than most. So from 1955 to 2008, across all governments, political parties, lots of different sort of policies, growth per head averaged 2.25% a year. We used to think this number was a constant in the UK. That we'd always grow. There would be some fluctuations about that, but that would be the average. Since 2008, we've 0.4% a year. So it's gone down from 2.25% a year to 0.4% a year. So we have a big problem. Lots of other countries face a big problem. All countries, all advanced economies in the world have suffered this since the global financial crisis, but we have suffered it more than most. If we had kept on the 2.25% growth rate since 2008, by now we would be per head £10,000 better off per head. The cost of living crisis would be a hell of a lot easier to deal with if every person, man, woman and child in this country had an extra £10,000. So big is we need to do something about productivity and sorting out the low growth rate we've had since 2008. I mean, just in another terms, we've gone from being sort of Germany to being Italy over the last 12 years or so. And that is really big. It means it's really big and it's difficult. It makes politics difficult. I fully understand that. So we've gone, just to look at Conservative sort of slogans from 2007, where it's all about sharing the proceeds of growth, to 2016, where it's about taking £350 million a week from Brussels and giving it to the NHS. So something from sharing to sort of grabbing. And that's difficult in politics, and it means that there is also a resentment that the people have when it's quite likely they're going to be worse off per year because the economy is not growing. And that makes things difficult everywhere. So that's what's really big. So when we have something that's really big to deal with, we need to think about really big solutions and what the real big problems to faster growth are. So we've lost 23% of our economy relative to the previous growth rate. That is enormous. You look at Brexit, we think probably that's going to hit us by about 4%. Probably we've had half of that hit already. We'll get some benefits of Brexit. But the main thing is it's added friction to our borders, and that's a cost. And so one thing is big and can be done very quickly is not to make that cost any worse. So I think I commend the Minister here, because I think it comes from you that we might maybe go to delay again putting border controls in the favour. I wish that would be a decision that you took for principled reasons, not to make things worse, rather than because we don't have borders, we can't do it. But that is and actually would be a very good thing straight away. There's no need for borders there, and it would be a very good thing if we made that permanent rather than temporary. But I think we also need to think about the medium term, that we want to be rebuilding bridges with our European neighbours. It is still our biggest trading partner. There's no point in having huge frictions on those borders, which we have put in place ourselves. And so Brexit's not going to change, we're out, we're not going back in, but we want to make that relationship as good as possible. The second thing is something that Ben brought up. Second really big thing that we have a problem in this country is land use. It is crazy that we have different land prices depending on what ministers or local officials say can be done on those lands. Hugely different prices, bits of land neighbouring each other. That means that companies cannot invest where they want, people cannot live where they want, cannot afford it. So we have lots of people who do everything right in school, and then they get faced with choice as an adult. Do they live where they can't get necessarily a great job, or do they live where they can get a great job but they can't afford it? That is not a good choice for our countries, and a lot of that comes down to land use. So we need to sort out our planning system and our land use system in this country. It's been like this for years. We keep saying we need to do it, but we don't do it. And again, I'm not underestimating the political difficulties of this, and I know that political parties, particularly the Dems most recently, took advantage of difficulties in the southeast over this. But this is, so if we're serious about sorting our economy out, that is the second thing. Third thing we need to get regulations right is on something that's really big, climate change, getting to net zero in the least economically damaging way possible. We don't want to kill the planet, so we have to decide that net zero is a good thing, but there are good and bad ways of doing this, ranging from very little cost to our economy to very great cost to our economy. So that is another big thing the government has to do. And finally, investment. Investment has stalled in this country since 2016. Part of that was about uncertainty. That uncertainty is now over, but it's now the time that we need to be really clear about why people, both domestic companies and foreigners, should invest in the UK, because our investment performance has been shocking since 2016. So those are the four big things I think we need to concentrate on. Small things, I think we don't need to concentrate so much on making our Singapore on Thames. Not going to work these days, because we have an now border with the EU. Before, you could have more free market here, drag investment over, and there's nothing that European countries could do about it. Now they can raise barriers because that is their sovereignty, and that's what they can do now. Whether people work from home or work in the offices, not going to make a lot of difference. It's small, potentially even negative. There's a trade-off between the improvement in efficiency you can get from not having to commute to the loss you get from not being with your colleagues. This is going to be a small thing. Tax generally is about distribution, not so much about efficiency overall. Same thing with free trade agreements. They're good, let's be absolutely clear about that, but they're small. Free ports generally do most of their impact on redistributing activity around the UK rather than increasing it in the country as a whole. So, just to conclude, we are a successful advanced economy. We've had a huge economic problem since 2008, and I put no blame on the government for that. It's just that we should recognise that it exists. Let's not compound it by making things worse with Brexit. And to do this, we have to focus on the big and the small, and maybe have some genuine political courage, and maybe be a bit more like Mrs. Thatcher and a bit less like some other politicians. We know that.
Any speaker at a CPS event who says we need to be a bit more like Margaret Thatcher is going to get invited back.
I did that as well.
We've got a limited time for questions and discussion, so I'll try and rattle through them using the ones we've been asked as well as my own. But it feels like this all sort of, it feels like everyone's having the same conversation, which is recognising we have a really big problem, and that there are ways to solve it: investment, productivity, etc., and that regulation is at the heart of this. And, Minister, you mentioned the benefits of Brexit white paper. I mean, there was a striking line in that from our point of view. So I should say, by the way, the CPS has big projects coming out on regulation and investment, which you should look for in the next month or two. But there was a line in there saying it would be great to have a target for one in, 2 out, or some sort of headline target for reducing regulation. But unfortunately, we can't, because we're going to do so much regulating on net zero and on new technologies. Is there not a contradiction here?
Net zero is going to be a huge regulatory cost, and that is an issue for the country to face and to face up to. And if we were to have a 1 in, 1 out or 1 in, 2 out rule, you would end up excluding net zero, as we previously excluded EU regulation, and then you're tinkering at the edges because you're ignoring the biggest piece of regulation. So what we need to do is to look at the whole picture, all the regulation, and we actually need to explain to voters what we are doing, because if voters know what we're doing, they can make choices. But I thought the point about doing net zero for 2050 at the lowest cost rather than the highest cost is fundamental. And if we know what the costs are, then voters will be able to choose. And the Prime Minister set this out in an article for The Sun last year, saying that the way to net zero was through technological change and innovation, not through endless regulation.
So a question from Rajan Russell is, he asked, Ronald Reagan said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language were, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. What would the panellists' 9 most terrifying words be now? If anyone wants to...
Well, I've got 9 words, given to me by my brilliant team. We need to remain in lockstep with the EU. Those are the 9 words that I think are the most frightening at the moment.
I don't think it changes from what Ronald Reagan said, to be honest. I mean, the net zero stuff is a really interesting point that I think often gets lost, because the regulatory framework that we need for net zero is arguably to remove some of the regulation that doesn't allow some of these technologies to get into the market. Because the Minister's right, the way that we get to net zero is through technological change. At the moment, the civil service seems to think it's through mass subsidy, and that's a major issue. I mean, it's very easy, we use the example in Teesside, it's very easy to reduce carbon outputs. I mean, we cut our carbon emissions by 50% and we put 3,000 people out of work and close the steelworks. I mean, it's dead easy to do if you want to do it. But if you want to do it in a sensible, transitioned way where you're not costing jobs or the economy, then, for example, if you look at things like CCUS, you look at hydrogen in particular, the regulatory framework that's already in place that prohibits the use of hydrogen, for example, in our heating network. If you look at things like sustainable aviation fuel, where you cannot put 100% sustainable aviation fuel into an aeroplane, those are regulations that are in the UK. So actually deregulation of some of these things, as long as they are safe, which actually a lot of the evidence suggests that they are, would allow us to accelerate there without subsidy. Because if you look at an announcement that the Prime Minister made just a few weeks ago, Alphanar, a Saudi investor, have just bought a large plant in Teesside to produce more than 2,500 barrels of sustainable aviation fuel. Yes, it's a drop in the ocean for what we actually need to achieve. Their biggest problem is, well, we can't put it into planes at the minute because you're only allowed 50% to go across what is called the hull of the wing. You know, there are some really basic things. If you look at hydrogen, for instance, you could have a really smart regulatory framework where you could pump hydrogen into the gas network. And let's not forget, I mean, the government have just gone through a 5-year process of saying, yes, we can put 20% of hydrogen into the current network. Well, in the 60s, when we had town gas, 50% of it was already hydrogen. But we've re-regulated ourselves to say, well, 20% is fine. And actually, we think you can go much higher to 100%. Now, if you use regulatory in a clever way, actually, things like decarbonisation of the gas network doesn't have to cost the taxpayer anything, because if you can set a regulatory framework that creates that supply, that creates that demand, the investors will take care of themselves. I mean, as Tracy's already said, the world is awash with money that especially wants to come into this space. And if the government was clear to say, yes, we're going to move towards hydrogen, or yes, we're going to allow it into the system, the money would come into the UK. But everybody I speak to on an international scale says, we love the idea, but until we get clarity from government, we can't invest in this because there's no certainty.
But Tracy, this speaks to your point about regulators, but also just quickly, sometimes the media reaction to deregulation. So there was a headline in the Telegraph about these trials that you're talking about, saying, you know, putting hydrogen in gas boilers leads to, you know, 8 exploding boilers, like 50 exploding boilers a year or something like that.
Yeah.
And I then did a slightly angry thread pointing out that we currently have something like 150 exploding boilers a year. So what you're saying, your real headline there is putting hydrogen in boilers is massively safer than our current system, and also there's a widget you can put in for the cost of 40 quid, which means that no boilers explode at all.
I couldn't come up with 9 words, but I can come up with 7, which is it's for your safety and security. So I think there has, over the last 20 or 30 years, not just in regulators, but in the media, whatever, there has become this huge risk-averse culture where it is all about 50 exploding boilers rather than 80 exploding boilers or whatever it is. And you have that in every single regulator. You have it in financial services regulation. You have it everywhere, where we're quite happy to let external investors, international investors, come in and invest in the UK, but we're prohibiting our own investment in the UK with our own savings because, it might be too risky. That's just the wrong balance.
So this is specifically about the rules which basically say you as a pension investors can buy certain classes of assets.
Yeah.
They have to weight it toward,
Yeah, absolutely. Or the amount of capital you have to hold as an insurance company or a bank, whatever it is. we are discouraging our own, or just the structure of the market. And there are structural things in the UK with pension funds and insurance companies that cause this. But we're actively discouraging our own investment while we're going out to the Canadians, the Chinese, Australians, etc., to have them come in and do it. That's just mad. When we actually have far more assets in the UK that are sitting there in long-term savings than they do externally. It's a crazy situation.
So my 9 words would be, this policy scores well in focus groups, do it. That's very scary. What do I think? I mean, looking at net zero in particular, we are going to have regulations, because if we were going to get to net zero with no regulations, if the technology was literally could do it on its own, then we could just butt out of the situation. And we wouldn't have to have government there at all. But we do think there's at least a cost, at least in the short term, and therefore you're going to have some regulation, or what I would prefer to see is effectively a proper price on carbon, because that is the way that then the private sector could most easily take its decisions on what is best for it in the long term, so that it wouldn't have to have governments telling it that this is the technology you need to use, or that, and that is the best way. It's quite hard to have a carbon price in one country, which is high, and then you have to start thinking about proper things like having carbon border taxes, which the UK is thinking about, so is Europe, and but these have wider international ramifications. But that is the way, would be the best way that we could get the world to go down this route with the least amount of very detailed regulations.
Now, we've got a slightly specific question, which I'm going to widen out a bit, because we don't have much time. But James Hawkins from the Food and Drink Regulation said his sector is facing a deluge of different regulations from different government departments. Is there a mechanism in government that takes account of the cumulative effect of these? And separately, George Eustace has stated that the government is conducting an ad hoc review of policy and regulation with a view to pausing different items. Can the Minister comment on that work? So what I'd like to sort of expand that out to, a food and drink sector as well, but Ben, when we were talking before, you were saying that the EU structural funding, the new rules have come in, and one stream has been replaced by 3 streams, each of which have a separate board and separate processes. I mean, is there an issue that we, in terms of regulation, and then this, that we just no branch of government thinks about what other branches are doing, and also related to the second part of this is, I mean, during our own work on regulation, we found that actually DEFRA, we think, is the only department in the UK which has done an actual stocktake of all of the regulations it imposes. I mean, is there a need for more of a stocktake? I mean, amazing. Jacob or Ben, I guess we start with you on either of those elements.
Well, certainly on the stocktake, and we are doing that for the EU, and this is why I have this list of about 1,500. And it's absolutely fascinating that there are dozens and dozens and dozens in BEIS that are just the detailed regulations of how products should be manufactured, that outside the EU are rules that aren't usually, or certainly aren't invariably, there. And now we're outside. We shouldn't be thinking, how do we change this regulation, but do we need this regulation at all? And the thing we need to bear in mind is an awful lot of regulation is protectionist regulation. It isn't even there for safety. It is there to stop people outside the EU competing with those inside the EU. And we have adopted those, and they become de facto trade barriers. And we need to be getting rid of those. We need to have a system where people are able to buy things that are safe, not ones that skew regulations to existing incumbents. And I completely agree with the point on investment regulation that tries to stop people taking any investment risk. And this is where changing Solvency II is going to be so important, to allow investors to take the risk that they think matches their liability, rather than thinking that the government knows. It doesn't. I was a pension fund trustee of the Conservative Agents Pension Fund for many years, which was an underfunded pension fund. And the advice from the regulator was always to buy gilts, which just locked in the underfunding. And if we wanted to buy equities, the regulator thought that was frightfully dangerous. Now, my background is in emerging market investment management, so I obviously have a prejudice in favour of equities, so I make that clear that I'm not trying to talk my own book. I'm just saying that risk needs to be decided by the owner of the liability, rather than by the government, and you need to allow people choice. Some people like going on roller coasters. I don't particularly, but that should be a choice for people to take the risk rather than the government saying they can't.
But you do love zip wires.
I love zip wires. Zip wires are great. Yes.
I was like, we covered this when we spoke at conference, but if anyone wants to look it up, there is a picture of Jacob zip wiring in a three-piece tweed suit, which is quite wonderfully on.
What else would you wear for a zip wire?
But Ben?
Yeah, I don't like zip wires or roller coasters. I'll just sit in the bar and watch. But there's, separate from kind of the wider EU stuff, you've got an issue within government that, and I say this externally because I'm not involved in government, obviously, is that each department actually is its own thing in itself. It's its own company, really, that has a central point of funding through Treasury. And that lack of joined-up approach, you know, we've got the best minister here to try and deregulate and get rid of unneeded regulation from the EU. But if you look at what's happening, for example, there's a whole lot of stuff that sits with DFT, for instance, around, for example, net zero, hydrogen in particular. But there's also half of it that sits with BEIS, and neither of the two shall meet. And the knowledge build-up actually in BEIS is really strong over the last 4 or 5 years. But DFT have literally just started this journey 6 months ago and are going to go on the same 5-year journey where BEIS were 5 or 6 years ago. And there's a really interesting experiment going on in Darlington with the Treasury campus that Rishi set up. Because the campus is, in effect, a single campus. It's a single building where you've got BEIS, DULUC, DIT, Treasury, and a couple of others, DCMS, all in the same building. And when you speak to the civil servants who have already either moved up or have been recruited in, some of the DGs think it's marvellous that all of a sudden they can speak to some of their colleagues from a different department. And that joined-up approach to government, separate from kind of EU regulation, is really important if we want to be more competitive. Because sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing in government. And that's as an archaic nature of where the government is set up. We're still set up in an analog age. And also in the system where departments were sovereign within their own right, and actually because of the complexity of the future of the economy, the 21st century, actually there is a lot of requirements for departments to work collaboratively, but the system isn't set up in that way. So that requires real serious civil service reform. I don't necessarily see that coming at the minute because we've got enough to bite off.
Do you have anything?
Good.
I just want to say, I'm not going to make any comment about exactly how government works. That's certainly not my area of any expertise whatsoever. But it is obviously the job of government always to try and make regulation effective. And I think there's two things that you need to really think about in effective regulation. Is clearly you don't want to have too much, and we've spoken a lot about that already. But equally, you've got to be sure for the country that you don't have too little or you don't enforce it badly. And I'll give you two examples where we in this country have failed on that in recent years. One is in building codes, which led to the Grenfell fire, and now a huge cost of having to reclad lots and lots of buildings. So that is chucking out, just saying we don't care about regulations doesn't take away problems that are ultimately going to land up in government. And the other is obviously the global financial crisis, which was essentially a global regulatory failure of not having sufficient safety in banking. Now, we might have gone too far after that, but we certainly have got ourselves into a position that cost us many, many trillions of pounds and dollars and euros by allowing banks to not take sufficient safeguards during the financial crisis. So to say that you don't need regulations at all is a simplification far too far.
It is a simplification far too far, but a lot of it's been of our own making in terms of the complexity of regulation. So just to give an example, in 1990 there were 6,000 pages of regulations about pensions. Now there's 126,000 pages. That just cannot be productivity enhancing in any way, shape or form. So if that's happening in one area, how many other areas is it happening in, and what can we do about that? And none of that is EU imposed. It is absolutely imposed by the government.
Can I just add just very quickly, because this is a very specific piece of regulation, which again, it's not about safety, it's not about protection, it's in effect a process that the government have set up for no reason in my mind that I can see. If you look at something called the Automotive Transformation Fund, which is a fund that the government have in effect set up to try and attract automotive sector to the UK, either in OEMs or in the supply chain, gigafactories, whatever it might be. The process and regulation, if you want to apply for an ATF grant as an investor, I know of a couple of investors who've come to the UK and said, we want to bring a gigafactory to the UK. Brilliant. UK kind of say, okay, well, where do you want to go? Do the usual thing that government would do to try and entice that investment. They've then said, we want to apply for the ATF to get some support to come to the UK. Well, if you want to apply for that, the requirement of that rule is you have to go and find another site elsewhere outside of the UK and explain why that is better than the UK, and then we might be able to fund some of the difference. In both of the occasions of the two gigafactories that I'm speaking to, they've now found another site that they were never really interested in the first place in mainland Europe, and said, actually, this is pretty good. We might just stay in Europe. And they would never have even considered anywhere else other than the UK if it wasn't for the regulation from the civil servant that said, if you want to apply for this grant, you've got to go and find another country and another site and tell us why that's better. That is just bizarre to me, that we've got ourselves into a regulatory position where we've got an investor saying we want to come to the UK, bring us here, and we've sent them away.
Yep.
In theory, we've basically sent them away and made our job more difficult for ourselves. That is a failure of regulatory output.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to sneak in one more question since we started a couple of minutes late, but very, very quick answer, lightning round answers. So Georgina Edwards of the UK Travel Retail Forum says, one brilliant benefit of Brexit, which would benefit regional airports like Teesside, I mean, she's really done her homework here, is allowing passengers to buy duty-free goods on arrival at UK airports. Are there other examples like this that you can... So, like, if there's just like one very small, not something that Jacob can go back to his office and just get done today. Any quick examples?
I think he's doing a marvellous job, so I can't think of anything that he's not already doing.
Well, I've made a note of the Automotive Transformation Fund. Well, that's just bonkers. I do have one in that area, which I'm working on. I can't promise it's going to happen, but there's a package holidays directive, which means that if you are a bed and breakfast and you sell a theatre ticket to the people who come to stay with you, and you make this a package, or you sell dinner at the restaurant 3 doors down in the street, you have to be registered as if you are somebody in Carry On Abroad, sending people off to a holiday in a hotel that hasn't been built in Spain. And because of that, it's the Carry On Abroad directive. Because of that experience in the 1970s and 80s, there is this directive which stops people doing incredibly sensible and minor packages that are regulated as if they're full-blown. And there are lots of these things. That's why I really want, if any of you have these individual examples, there are so many little bits of regulation that have a big economic cost.
I have one. Just off the back of what the Minister's just said. We've just been hit in Teesside, which I think has affected the South West for a couple of years now already, is nutrient neutrality for housing development. And Natural England, literally 3 weeks ago, without any consultation, just decided to slap on nutrient neutrality as a requirement for any approval of housing, which now means that all 5 local authority areas that cover my area, plus some of Durham, plus some of North Yorkshire, have now said that they're not approving any housing plans at all. Probably won't do for the next 2 years unless they get some real clarity from government that they're allowed to. And it affects anything where there is an overnight stay. So it's housing, but it's also bed and breakfasts, hotels, doesn't affect commercial and industrial. And I understand that that is from an ECJ ruling in Holland from 2017, 2018. We talk about competitiveness, right? The Natural England have just come in, government are not doing anything, and then now you've in effect got an area that covers over 1 million people, 5 local authority areas saying we're just shutting up shop and we're not approving. And actually, interestingly, where it's affected places like the Sol and elsewhere in the country, the rumour is, and this is just hearsay, some of the local authorities are using that to their advantage to say we don't ever really have to approve
local authorities not wanting to build houses.
Yeah, but they use it. But the thing is, they don't look like the bad guys anymore because all of a sudden nutrient neutrality comes in and say we can't do anything about it. They're not trying to solve it because they don't want to. That for me is madness.
The other part of that, of course, is nitrate neutrality, which is you have to do very deep studies on fertiliser runoff, even if you're building on a high street.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be phosphorus and nitrate neutral.
Very quickly, just for the Minister to go away and just make the principled case for not putting in the same border that the EU imposes on us in Dover. Do it straight away.
Unilateral free trade. Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much to our panel, and thank you all very much for joining us. It's been utterly fascinating, but hopefully we have moved the dial. Well, judging by the notes that the Minister has been taking, we've moved the dial very slightly in favour of growth and productivity. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much to our panellists.